So originally this talk was titled The Evolution of Methodological Naturalism. And the talk itself has evolved quite a bit since I started. And we're still gonna discuss that, but it's not the only thing we're going to talk about. Because there's both philosophical and historical considerations of methodological naturalism we need to take a look at. Because I kind of figure that methodological naturalism, there's several foundations of it that we need to look into. But before we begin, we should probably look at what the definition of methodological naturalism is. So I'm going to go by the National Academy of Sciences definition, which says that because science is limited to explaining the natural world by means of natural processes, it cannot use supernatural causation in its explanations. Similarly, science is precluded from making statements about supernatural forces because these are outside its province. Okay, so a few things to note there. First of all, anytime I bold a lot of stuff, just put your eyes to it. So anytime I have bold or italics, that's mine, not the person being quoted. So it's very interesting that, so this is kind of the typical statement of methodological naturalism. But there's actually several unstated philosophies that are at work here. One of them is mechanical philosophy. And that is the idea that the world is entirely matter in motion. And that's usually what people mean by naturalism. Because for any word to have a meaning, you have to actually give it, you have to give it content. And so usually when people say naturalism, they don't mean everything that exists, because then we wouldn't need the word. They mean something specific, and they usually mean mechanical philosophy. So for example, if I say, angels and demons, most people wouldn't consider that to be when science says it's naturalistic, they wouldn't say that, well, that should include angels and demons if they existed. They would say that no, those are precluded. And the reason they're precluded is because they're not part of mechanical philosophy. The second part is a positivist pragmatist epistemology. And that is the idea that all true knowledge has practical implications. So that's why the science is limited, because science is limited things where they can that they can test. So they view mechanical philosophy as providing the thing to test, and pragmatist and positivist epistemology is what to test. And then you have what I call theological incomprehensibility. And this is the idea that God's ways are not just beyond humans' ways, but that they are wholly inaccessible to rational debate and discussion. That's one of the reasons why methodological naturalism focuses on science being limited, because basically their view is that that God-focused things cannot be discussed in a rational manner. Okay, and so these three things kind of are they kind of inter-support each other. So theological incomprehensibility and positivist epistemology go together, because so the people who would believe in theological incomprehensibility think that theological statements are basically meaningless, that God is so different from us that we can't possibly say anything rational about him and have it mean anything. Well, positivists think that too. I mean, they think that for different reasons. Most of the people in positivism don't believe God exists, but they agree with the theologians who are saying this, because they too think that talk about God is meaningless. Likewise, this decrease in trust of theology leaves mechanism as the only remaining option for rationality. So if you remove the spiritual component, if you say we can't even talk about it, well, that leaves, if you want to have a rational discussion, that only leaves mechanical philosophy as anything that you can have a rational discussion about. Likewise, mechanical philosophy implies that truth is only about motion. And that goes well together with positivist epistemology, which looks to matter and motion as being the only sources of truth. So you can see how these three ideas kind of hang off of each other and reinforce each other is more important. They're mutually reinforcing. So basically, because of positivism, materialists don't care what theologians have to say about a divine realm that the theologians themselves can't comprehend. And if one is convinced of theological incomprehensibility, then trying to add an incomprehensible divine realm into a scientific framework is literally introducing meaningless statements, which reinforces positivism's view. And then the growth of mechanical philosophy made it easy to bleed theological incomprehensibility into a generalized doubtfulness about anything of a spiritual immaterial nature. So basically what happens, and we'll see this happen explicitly later, that as originally theological incomprehensibility was just about God, and so we just couldn't understand God, but we could understand any secondary cause. But with the growth of mechanical philosophy, this actually, the number of things that were counted as things that we can understand under theological incomprehensibility kept on going up. And so if one cannot comprehend the immaterial, but you can comprehend the material, then it does make sense to exclude the immaterial from theoretical consideration. So we're going to talk about the first leg of positivism and pragmatism. Okay. Now, positivism and pragmatism are not the same thing. Pragmatism says that good ideas have cash value. You can count on them to bring useful results regardless of their truth value. Okay, so there's a difference between what the actual truth is and the truths that we claim to know. So pragmatism says we don't really care so much about whether it's really, really true. We just care about whether or not we can use it. Positivism turns pragmatism into a full truth claim. It says that true propositions must be verifiable by empirical means. And so the basic difference between these two is that a non-empirically verifiable statement in pragmatism is worthless, and in positivism it's meaningless. So now so epistemology under positivism, these are not all bad, but just kind of some effects is that basically knowledge must lead to somewhere. So we can't have truths hanging out there on their own that don't lead to an impact in our lives. Okay, so any truth that sits alone is meaningless or worthless. So if I say that God is good, well, if I can't deduce something from that, if I can't, if there's nothing in reality that I can change from that, then it's not really a meaningful statement. And truth doesn't exist for its own sake, only for the sake of action. And anything not empirically justifiable is meaningless. Okay? So now positivism is actually self-refuting, right? Because positivism says that any statement not empirically justifiable is meaningless. Well, that is not an empirically justifiable proposition. Because by its own lights, positivism would have to be meaningless. Okay, so that's, as a full description of things, positivism cannot be true. But there's also the individual bits of positivism are also problematic. And we've seen this with the growth of various types of theories. Gödel incompleteness shows that there are knowable mathematical truths that are not verifiable from a fixed set of axioms. Okay, and so I'm not going to go into heavy detail on Gödel incompleteness, but it's a really interesting area of discussion that I think is worth digging into. And then Quine's ontological relativity says that all statements are part of a larger web of belief structures. And this goes with Hansen's idea that even empirical knowledge is model-based. Okay, so if positivism says that only empirical statements are valuable, well, if all of our empirical knowledge is actually model-based, then that means that you actually need the models first. And that's something that Dr. Baggis was also explaining, that you need a model first in order to put empirical information in order to even measure something. You need to have a model on which to measure it. So that seems to refute positivism, because positivism would put empiricism first. But here we see that it's actually not first, but relied on by it relies on model building. And the last one is that there is the existence of real but not externally verifiable truths. I do not have, I can see you all there, and I presume you're all conscious, but I don't have an empirically verifiable way to know that you're conscious. So there are truths that we know, but that we cannot verify externally. So so you can see that positivism as a foundational philosophy doesn't really work. Now, pragmatism is basically the instrumental view. So it says that it doesn't try to be a full philosophy. It just says we're going to study, we're going to value ideas that have results. So a lot of people mistake the one for the other. But the problem with pragmatism is because it's entirely instrumental, it can't be the foundation of a realist vision of science. So if your view of science is that you're finding out real truths, you're finding out reality, well, you can't do that on pragmatism, because pragmatism doesn't claim to do that. Now you could be saying, there is a non-realist view of science that says that we're not actually finding out reality, we're just finding out instrumental truths. And if that's where you want to go, then pragmatism would work, but it doesn't actually work if you're trying to find out truth about nature. So now we're going to go into mechanical philosophy, which, as I said, is basically what they mean by naturalism. And now mechanical philosophy, what's interesting is it's actually held several forms. So we're going to start out with talking about mechanical philosophy in the 1600s. Okay. So mechanical philosophy has never been fully unified, but you can basically say that in the 1600s there was atomism, which says that physics is based on the geometry of solid particles. Okay, and one of their goals was to get rid of Aristotelian qualities and scholastic powers. So basically, the scholastics, which were kind of the theologians of that time, said that matter had powers, and so different things had different powers to do things, and so the atomists said, no, it's all based on the geometry of these different atoms. The second is localism, and that's changes happen to things next to each other. All right, so you only have contact action. If two things aren't next to each other, they're not going to interact. The third thing is gradualism. Changes always happen gradually. And the last one is passivism. So actions happen to bodies. Like, if you think about Legos don't really exert much of an influence on anything else. They just have energetic forces happen to them. And so these were kind of this is the mechanical philosophy in the 1600s. Now it's really interesting. So if this is naturalism, right? This is basically what naturalism in the 1600s held to. So that would mean that Newton was the first non-methodological naturalist, because he violated all of these ideas about what naturalism should be, the way nature should be. He said that gravity is a power or quality. It's not the result of the geometry of an object. It's an inner power. It exhibits influence over a distance, and it's an active force. Okay. Now, he retained gradualism, but that was pretty much the only aspect of mechanical philosophy that held over with Newton. So what's really, really interesting is if you look at the criticisms of Newton. Okay, so here's what Leibniz said about Newton. It says, it is a supernatural thing that bodies should attract one another at a distance without any intermediate means, and that a body should move around without receding in the tangent, though nothing hinders it from so receding. For these effects cannot be explained by the nature of things. So basically, Leibniz said that gravity violated methodological naturalism. In fact, other terms that were applied to gravity in critiques were that it was an occult force. Okay, so that Newton was proposing spiritual forces rather than physical forces. Eventually, Newtonian physics became the foundation of physics, and when people say naturalism today, a lot of them think of Newtonian mechanics, but actually, at the time, Newton was a critic of methodological naturalism of his time. So then you have mechanical philosophy in the 1800s, and so you have a very stripped down version of, they kind of retained what they could, but tried to renew it. And so basically, it held to the causal closure of nature and determinism, which those kind of go together. And it was matter focused, so everything was bits and blocks, and everything could be determined. One thing that was nice about Newtonian mechanics is that you could plug stuff into equations and get future results. And so they thought, well, if we continue this indefinitely, then we will get determinism. So this was best expressed by Pierre Laplace. I don't know actually how to say his name. He says, we may regard the present state of the universe as the effect of the past and the cause of the future. An intellect which at any given moment knew all of the forces that animate nature and the mutual positions of the beings that compose it. If this intellect were vast enough to submit the data to analysis, could condense into a single formula the movement of the greatest bodies of the universe and that of the lightest atom. For such an intellect, nothing could be uncertain, and the future, just like the past, would be present before its eyes. Okay, so this is the vision of mechanical philosophy in the 1800s. But this was broken by quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics says that all descriptions of nature's actions are actually partial. Determinism is actually only a probabilistic determinism. In fact, it even says that matter itself is a fuzzy concept. So the mechanical philosophy dealt with matter, but it's a fuzzy concept. And some interpretations of quantum mechanics actually say that consciousness is a first-class entity within physics. So just kind of torpedoing the whole concept of a matter-focused universe altogether. And then gradualism is killed the last pin in the plank of 1600s mechanical philosophy by getting rid of gradualism. So you can see that every time that there's a new mechanical philosophy, it merely takes the latest developments and labels it mechanism. So whatever we have been doing, now that's mechanical, right? So basically, each concept of mechanism died when new physics was discovered. So therefore, we can either classify mechanical philosophy as false because every instance gets falsified, or it's meaningless because if you can't settle on a fixed definition, and every time you have new information you have to change the definition, then what good is the term? Okay? So naturalism itself is a very problematic term. Now, in the 21st century, there's been two attempts to resuscitate naturalism. This first one just illustrates the problem, okay? And that is they relabel mechanism to be anything that is a phenomena that has any kind of parts, that have any kind of structure, and any kind of causal relationship, all right? So with this definition of mechanical philosophy, it removes any conceivable phenomena from being non-mechanical. So it basically more or less eliminates itself as a definition, right? So how would you classify something as non-mechanical under this scheme? You pretty much couldn't. And so it's difficult to see how someone can count this as mechanism in the traditional sense and not just a way of saving face for mechanical philosophy. So the other possibility is computationalism, and that computation holds a limitation on the abilities of that calculation holds the limits to what's natural. But it's also unlikely to last, and we'll talk about this more in my next talk, which is this afternoon. So theological comprehensibility, we talked about this. Now Christians have tended to cause lots of problems because we use this as a scapegoat. Okay? Anytime we run up against something we can't understand, we say, oh, well, God's ways are bigger than our ways. And so when you do that over and over again, it develops the habit. And so people have just kind of fallen into just doing that. And so some people take it even further and say, well, we just can't understand anything about God. It was originally about God, but it was later extended to secondary causes. You can see this in the Origin of Species, where in the 3rd edition, he said, well, God is incomprehensible. And in the 6th edition, we say, well, he says any internal force that's causing evolution, well, that's incomprehensible, so that's going to be the same as miracle. So we basically equated the two classes. But the problem is that theological incomprehensibility actually makes biology incomprehensible. Because biologists at one point wouldn't even say that, you know, a bird makes a nest in order to lay eggs, because that was too teleological, which was not naturalistic. And then also trying to describe human behavior is also problematic in this way. Also, the idea that the introduction of theological ideas inhibits science is disproved in the history of science itself. The first biology experiment, taxonomy, genetics, Big Bang Theory, all of these have their roots in supernatural causation and supernatural thought. So this is what the statement looks like when you remove the parts that are that we've shown to be not that we've shown to be irrational. You basically lose pretty much all of it. I should have actually marked out more of it than I did. So now what we have to do is you have to figure out how to reestablish non-mechanical knowledge. Okay? One of the advantages of methodological naturalism was that you know, we had theologians making unhinged, meaningless pronouncements, and that led another group of theologians to make statements that said that, well, we can't know anything. So if we replace naturalism, then we need to require a way to include statements about immaterial things which are epistemically warranted. Okay, so the job of reconstructing science without methodological naturalism will consist of developing criteria for establishing warrant and justification, and developing usable methodologies based on these systems of warrant and justification. And it'll also require the investigator to be bold enough to investigate immaterial in the face of disrepute, and be humble enough to restrict claims to those that can be justified. And then you also have to be able to be inventive enough to establish criteria, right? So you have to be able to establish that criteria, and also establish criteria for interrelating multiple domains of knowledge. Okay? And then recognize how differing methodologies affect the limits of their justifiable usage, their epistemic weight, and the ability to combine data. All right. So I'll now open up for questions. We've got 10 minutes, and so unmute your mic if you have a question, and let's go from there. Go for it.
Well, thanks for your presentation, Jonathan. Very stimulating, interesting.
I can't hear you. Can you get closer to the mic or turn yourself up?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I have a question about the theological incomprehensibility and the theological background of methodological naturalism. What do you think about historians like Ronald Numbers and Robert Bishop, who say that it's not grounded in incomprehensibility, but rather in the idea that God has created the world in an orderly way, and sort of division of labor, so to say, that methodological naturalism is a way to study natural causes operating in nature, and then it doesn't have to imply that the supernatural is totally outside of that rational consideration, just that the supernatural is outside of science. So what do you think about this kind of theistic evolutionist?
Yeah, so I think it's an understandable contention, and I don't necessarily disagree with him that the history when it was first proposed. I don't that the idea was that we're going to just separate these domains, but as I pointed out, that mechanical philosophy itself has kind of died out, and so the distinction that could have been made has kind of gone by the wayside. And then additionally, I think what's happened, and I've seen this because I've been to seminary myself, and you find that a lot of theologians are reluctant to say anything positive about the relationship of God and creation, like anything that's not positive as in good. I mean positive as in workable, and so, and if you actually look at, as I said, that's why I had the Darwin quote, is that he started out by saying that we can't, if you want to invoke God, then what you're doing is basically invoking a meaningless entity that we can't understand. But if you invoke, but he moved that to saying if you invoke even internal generators of evolution, that's too teleological for him, because that implies non-mechanical philosophy. And so he actually just discarded that with the same, he basically equated that, he basically equated that to, he equated that to being, relying on miracles. So anyway, sure, how much, yeah. So anyway, I think they both, I think they both happen, but what we would expect if someone was merely separating domains of knowledge, that we would also be working on, where they hinge, right? But the fact is that the place where they hinge never got any work, and the reason for that not got any work is because everyone assumed that the theological portion was just incomprehensible. You couldn't reduce it to something that you could make positive statements about. So, and as I said, in my next talk, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what kind of positive statements those could look like. Look at the mathematics of alternatives to methodological naturalism. But that's kind of where I stand. Other questions?
I have one. Well, first of all, Jonathan, thank you for your presentation. I enjoyed it, and it's interesting just to get some perspective and background on methodological naturalism. Some of the individuals that you spoke about, Newton and Laplace and others, it's interesting. Maybe they would be viewing methodological naturalism as sort of like a construct to see things. It wasn't the totality of how they would saw that they could see outside the box. And that's one of the things I'm starting to sort of explore in things that I'm looking at is, if you just constrain with what's in the box, you potentially may be losing the totality of what we can know. I also don't tend to be a fan of God of the gaps, but on the flip side, being aware that there are limits to what we can know. It's just like, even if you think in terms of sensors of any type, it has a certain fidelity and dynamic range. And if you don't admit that, you're going to get wrong information from the result of that. And so there's a lot of interesting things I'm sort of playing in my mind, that if you just define something so it's convenient, and you don't deal with these things that kind of gets into periphery that are issues, then you potentially going to come up to wrong conclusions. So those are just a few thoughts that I have. If you want to respond to that, but I like the nice survey, that there's a lot of good information in this.
Yeah, and I actually really like the idea of limited limited methodologies. The problem is that because limiting your methodology actually helps you to focus on something, and And because in order to think rigorously about something, you kind of have to push everything out of the way. The problem is that if you were merely doing it as a provisional way of, you know, releasing your mind from certain material, then you wouldn't have any problem with someone else who had a different cut, right? If someone else wanted to put their, you know, their set of boundaries, like if I did, you know, if I want to do history of art in from the 1600s to the 1800s, right? Well, that I wouldn't go around preventing people from doing a history of art from the 1500s to the 1700s, right? So those, I would say, okay, well, my limitation that I was using for my methods limited the period under observation here, and the fact that someone else has a different shift is of no consequence to me, and in fact, it helps me out because I can pull that information in. But what we actually see happening is that it was a stricture, and it was preventing, and which actually prevented that sort of thing from happening. And so by trying to establish absolute limits that no one could go past, it created the problem that I outlined.